I'll take this opportunity to introduce Karisa Cloward, who's my colleague at SMU. She's in the political science department. She's going to be talking about preference falsification and democratic revolutions, and I'll warn you all that she's recovering from laryngitis, and we have a pinch speaker ready to come in if her voice fails her. So I want to make a special expression of thanks for you coming out in these difficult circumstances for your voice. So we really appreciate having you here.
Hi, so bear with me. Given recent events in the Middle East and North Africa, I thought it would be sort of interesting and timely to talk a little bit about how democratic revolutions actually occur, particularly because what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, they're not totally unique events. Right, so they're not totally unique events. They have happened before, or similar events have happened before. Democratic revolutions driven by crowds and protests have been important in a number of transitions to democracy. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the overthrow of Ceausescu in Romania, the People Power Revolution that overthrew Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, and the June resistance that led to democratic elections in South Korea in 1987. These are all examples of this type of democratic transition from below. And so because this sort of thing does seem to happen from time to time, I'm going to talk about a theory that proposes to answer a number of important questions related to democratic revolutions. So first, why do they occur when they do, as opposed to 5 years before, or a year before, or a year later, or 5 years later? Why do dictatorships often seem stable right up until the moment that they collapse? And why are democratic revolutions so rare and so difficult to predict in advance? In retrospect, we often think of democratic revolutions as somehow inevitable. That they're the consequence of a number of factors that unavoidably push a country towards revolution. And yet a particularly interesting characteristic of many democratic revolutions is that they catch people totally by surprise. Nobody really thought that the Middle East was going to experience a wave of democratic protests anytime soon. I mean, it's still too early to tell whether, in fact, we will observe democracy, but the democratic protests themselves were quite surprising. The fall of communism in Europe also caught pretty much everybody off guard. Many sort of, very well-informed, seasoned political observers thought that, communism in Eastern Europe was going to go on for years and years more. Okay, so one common explanation for why revolutions are so rare is based on the idea that democratic revolutions are public goods. And public goods have two main characteristics. First, they're non-excludable, which basically means that if it's provided, everybody gets to enjoy it. Nobody can be excluded from it, and this is true even if they did absolutely nothing to help create it. Another characteristic is that they're non-rivalrous, which means that if someone consumes the good, there's still just as much for everybody else. Okay? And public goods include things like lighthouses, fire stations, national parks, as well as democracy. So collective action is, which is some sort of task that is jointly pursued by groups of people. It's generally required in order to produce public goods. Because these things are clearly desirable, right? They're public goods. Everybody wants them. You might think that individuals who are likely to benefit from them would sort of enthusiastically collaborate to produce them. However, there are sort of a number of compelling reasons why we might doubt whether individuals will take collective action to achieve what's actually in their common interest. So this is known as the collective action problem or the free rider problem. Right? So imagine that you live in Hosni Mubarak's Egypt. Right? What factors would you consider when deciding whether to join a pro-democracy protest? You know that one person is unlikely to be the decisive factor in determining whether a protest is going to be successful. Right? You also know that it is costly to participate in the protest because there are forces within the country whose sole job it is to repress these kinds of things. Right? So the decision to not participate, it's very appealing. If the pro-democracy rally fails, you've not paid any of the costs, right? You've not run the risk of incurring the dictator's wrath. If the democracy rally succeeds, you get to benefit from it just like everybody else, right? Because there's this non-excludability element. You can't, the people who fought for the democracy can't say, well, you weren't on the streets, you don't get to have a democracy, just the rest of us. Right? Once it exists for everyone. So you can free ride, essentially, on the efforts of anybody else who engage in this collective action. The problem is that everybody thinks this way, right? So nobody goes out on the streets because they all want to be the free rider and they all want to be the people who are not taking the risks but are still going to benefit from the rewards. So this is part of why we might think that people would be reluctant to engage in collective action. And so this provides one explanation for the sort of the apparent stability of authoritarian regimes. So, why we don't see mass movements all the time in opposition to authoritarian regimes. Just because many Egyptians shared a common interest in overthrowing the Mubarak regime, that doesn't automatically translate into their taking collective action to do something about it. And indeed, there was only sort of minimal public opposition to the regime for 30 years. This theory helps to explain why revolutions are so rare and why dictatorships often appear so stable, but it can't really explain the mass protests that eventually did bring the government down. Right now, participation becomes the puzzle that we want to be able to explain. So a political scientist named Timur Kuran constructed a theory to help explain phenomena like mass protests. He starts with an individual who must decide whether to publicly support or oppose a dictatorship. The individual has a private preference and a revealed public preference. Her private preference is her true attitude toward the regime, and her public preference is the attitude toward the dictatorship that she reveals to the outside world. Sometimes private and public preferences are the same, but it can be dangerous to reveal your opposition to a dictatorship. So there are good reasons to think that some people, indeed probably a lot of people, are going to engage in some type of preference falsification, saying they support the regime in public, but privately opposing it. One consequence of preference falsification is that individuals do not know the true level of opposition in a dictatorship because everyone seems to be publicly supporting it. In East Germany, right before the fall of the Berlin Wall, people in 1988 were still routinely applauding speakers whose message they disliked. They were joining organizations whose mission they opposed and signing defamatory letters against people they admired. The perception then is that society is publicly behind the dictatorship, right? Even if you have a belief, even if your private preference is opposed to dictatorship, you have no idea how many other people share that belief, right? Share that private preference, because everybody's public preference is basically in favor of this dictatorship, right? So preference falsification then, it provides an alternative but sort of complementary explanation for to the explanation that's provided by collective action theory for why there's sort of relative stability in authoritarian regimes. and suggests that even if collective action could be effectively organized, individuals might still choose not to protest because they are not sure whether other people really oppose the regime or not. So even though, although many people might be engaged in preference falsification, there is probably a protest size at which they would be willing to publicly reveal their true preferences. So they might not want to join a protest of only 100 people, but they might be willing to join a protest that already exists of 10,000 people or 100,000 people. Okay? As protest becomes larger, it becomes harder for dictatorships to monitor and punish each individual. Right? So the cost of collective action actually declines as protests, as the number of people participating in protests increases. So the protest size at which you are willing to participate can be thought of as your revolutionary threshold. And individuals have different revolutionary thresholds. Some people are really brave and quite happy to oppose the government, irrespective of whether other people do this. And we tend to think of these people as political dissidents. They have extremely low revolutionary thresholds. They gain some sort of extreme value from opposing the regime, even when they expect that their efforts are going to have no real impact. Right? Other people are probably scared and they're unwilling to protest unless lots of other people do. So these people have higher revolutionary thresholds. And some people support the regime no matter what. Some people actually genuinely support it. They're benefiting from the dictatorship. Right? So these people have extremely high revolutionary thresholds. They're unlikely to protest even under any circumstances, because what they want is for the regime to stay. They're not engaging in preference falsification. So as you might expect, people's thresholds are likely to depend on a variety of factors, such as whether they benefited or suffered under the regime, whether they have a lot to lose if their participation is found out, whether they believe the regime is fragile or stable. And some people also just have sort of a harder time living a lie. Right? They feel some sort of innate urge to tell the truth about what they believe and how they feel about the regime. Right? And it's the distribution of these revolutionary thresholds within a society that is really, really crucial in determining whether a revolution actually occurs. So imagine that you live in a 10-person society with the following threshold sequence. Right? So the numbers in brackets are the revolutionary thresholds of our 10 people. Right? The first person has a revolutionary threshold of 0, which means that she is going to go out and protest and speak out no matter what anybody else does. Right? She needs no other people participating in order for her to oppose the regime. The second and third individuals, they'll protest only if there are already 2 other people protesting. Right? The 10th person, they're never going to protest because they genuinely support the regime. So in this society, even if 9 of these people, everybody but our last person, privately opposes the regime, right? Only the first person is going to protest. Right? Even if 90% of the population wants things to change, we're only going to observe a 1-person protest because the second and third people, they each need 2 people out there on the streets in order to join in, and they're not going to get that because there's only 1, right? And so this society is stuck in this position with only 1 person protesting, and 1 person protesting is unlikely to produce any real change in society. But now suppose that something happens, and our second person becomes more alienated from the government. Or they're less fearful of the government, or there's some shock to the system that changes just this 1 person's revolutionary threshold, and it drops to 1. What happens then? With just this small change, now there is a 9-person revolt, right? Because our person number 1, they're still out there, and their threshold is 1. But now person number 2's threshold, their threshold was 0. Person number 2's threshold is 1, and there's already 1 person. So they'll go out. And person number 3 goes out because there are 2 people. And person number 4 because there are 3 people, and so on and so forth, until you get a 9-person revolt. when 90% of the population is out on the streets, you can be pretty confident that there's going to be a change in regime, right? And so it's this very small shift, though, in only one person's threshold, not necessarily in anyone's private feelings about the regime, that produces this enormous change. So this one person, they can tip the entire society, which is why models like this are sometimes called tipping models or threshold models, because you don't have to observe some massive shift in order to observe a sort of a revolutionary cascade through a society. But slight shifts, while they can produce these revolutionary cascades, they don't necessarily have to. It depends on where the shift occurs. So imagine that person 4 is instead the person whose revolutionary threshold changes, right? Now, again, we are still stuck with only a one-person revolt, even though the size of the shift in society is the same as it was before, because a different person was affected, because of somebody with a much higher threshold was affected. Nothing in the society is going to change. We're not going to observe any difference in what people actually do, right? Even though the size of the shift was the same increment. Right? So the same change in thresholds, it can lead to a revolution in one context, but it can also lead to a sort of small or abortive and ultimately unsuccessful protest in another. So some implications of the theory. One is that structural factors like the economy or the repressiveness of the regime, or shocks to the system, like economic recessions or revolutions in neighboring countries, these can cause private preferences and revolutionary thresholds to move without actually producing a revolution. So structural factors and shocks, they're not sufficient to produce revolutions in and of themselves, although they may make revolutions more likely by reducing individuals' revolutionary thresholds. Preference falsification means that a society's distribution of revolutionary thresholds is also never known to the individuals in that society, right? People keep their private preferences private and their public preferences public. And nobody knows whether these two things match up for most of society. This is particularly likely if the regime has sort of spies, right? In East Germany, there were, literally like 10% of the population was either officially working for the government or an informant for the government. So you had you couldn't even talk to your neighbors about what you might be thinking and get a sense of how much opposition there was to the regime, because you had no idea if your neighbor was an informant, right? So this distribution of revolutionary thresholds can be very hard for anybody to have any sense of what it looks like in advance. And so our inability to observe people's private preferences and their revolutionary thresholds conceals potential revolutionary cascades and makes revolutions basically impossible to predict. A society can come to the very brink of a revolution without ever knowing it, right? I mean, in our society, if person number 2 and person number 3 could just coordinate and go out there, it would have started a revolutionary cascade. But nobody knew what their private preferences were, right? So they didn't coordinate, so there was no revolution. So society can come to the very brink of a revolution without knowing it, or it can experience a revolution that basically catches even opponents of the regime completely by surprise. So the question is then, can we apply any of this to current events? So one sort of change throughout the world is the global recession, right? So this probably led to higher rates of unemployment in a lot of these countries, right? So this is one thing that might have changed people's revolutionary thresholds. In terms of specific countries, we can think of the possibility that a revolutionary cascade was sort of tipped off in Tunisia by the action of one man, right? This fruit vendor who was slapped in the face by a municipal inspector, right? And he went in front of the governor's office and he set himself on fire. And he died. And his family and friends then went to protest his death, right? And people observed them and join them. And then it got picked up on Facebook and picked up by Al Jazeera. And protests started to spread from outside of his own little town across the country, right? And basically, one person saying, I cannot put up with this anymore, right? Potentially was enough to start the entire country on this path of revolutionary cascade, right? And which eventually led to the Tunisian president Ben Ali fleeing the country. Right? We can also maybe see a demonstration effect across countries. So the successful revolution in Tunisia, it probably reduced people's revolutionary thresholds and encouraged pro-democracy protests elsewhere, right? So we might think that the Egyptian revolution was in some sense the product of reduced revolutionary thresholds in Tunisia, in Egypt, because of what happened in Tunisia, right? The events in Tunisia focused people's attention. It allowed for slightly better coordination. It allowed for people to say, gee, maybe it actually is possible to overthrow the regime. Maybe we won't be tortured and killed for going out on the streets and protesting, right? So maybe the costs are a little bit less, and we're a little bit more willing to go, even if there are fewer other people already out there, right? And so there's this sort of wave, this revolutionary cascade that may have occurred. And the other thing to think about is that obviously some countries in this region, even though they're basically all dictatorships, some countries didn't experience the level of protests that were observed in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, right? There were some, like a smattering of protests in Morocco. Nothing really happened. We shouldn't necessarily conclude that that's because people in Morocco are simply happier with the regime than people were in Tunisia or Egypt, right? It's just possible that the distribution of revolutionary thresholds mitigated against a revolutionary cascade. Morocco may have come very close, right, to sort of a flooding of the streets with protesters, but just didn't, because there just weren't enough people with low revolutionary thresholds in place. Right? So this is just a possible story, right? We can't. This is a story that is consistent with the evidence that we're observing now in the Middle East and North Africa. I can't necessarily tell you that this is actually what happened, but it fits the data. Right? This story of sort of small changes or shocks to the system sparking revolutionary cascades that can sort of expand throughout one country and possibly spill over to other countries. I think that it's a useful way of thinking about how these processes could occur as being sort of highly contingent events, right? That are in some sense utterly unpredictable, because we can't, necessarily build a model that says if a fruit vendor, right, in Sidi Bouzid gets slapped in the face, it's going to start a revolution that's going to spread throughout a region, right? But in some sense, the story makes sense. So you may or may not be convinced by the story, but I think it is one useful tool for sort of imagining how these types of movements spread throughout countries and throughout regions. So, thank you.
I think it was Victor Hugo that said, when dictatorship is a fact, revolution becomes a right.